Imagine a massive psychological experiment where you take millions of children, strip away adult supervision, introduce skyrocketing divorce rates, hand them a house key on a shoestring, and simply say, "Figure it out." You'd expect a generation of completely broken adults. But instead, this accidental social experiment forged the most psychologically unbreakable demographic alive today. Generation X. They are the generational middle child, the forgotten generation, entirely overshadowed by boomers and millennials. But psychologists have recently uncovered a fascinating paradox. Being completely ignored wasn't a disadvantage. It was a brutal, highly effective form of survival training. So how exactly did an entire generation turn latchkey neglect and a total lack of participation trophies into an impenetrable psychological armor? The answer lies in a hidden mental blueprint wired into the brains of those 70s and 80s kids. And once you understand how their minds actually work, you'll realize why being forgotten became their most dangerous weapon. To understand this impenetrable psychological armor, we have to go back to the volatile environment that forged it. The 1970s and 1980s weren't just an era of neon arcade games and MTV. They were a period of massive socio-economic upheaval. The traditional nuclear family was quietly exploding. Divorce rates hit a historic, all-time high in 1980, while the dual-income household rapidly became the new economic necessity. For the first time in modern history, millions of children were systematically coming home to completely empty houses. There were no helicopter parents micromanaging their time, no GPS tracking apps, no carefully curated adult-supervised playdates. Just a brass house key threaded on a shoelace or hidden under a plastic rock, a written list of chores, and a strict warning not to open the door for strangers. If you are a Gen Xer, this was simply your Tuesday. But if you are a millennial or Gen Z, this level of profound isolation probably sounds terrifying. Imagine being 9 years old, tasked with making your own dinner, supervising your younger siblings, and navigating household emergencies without a smartphone to call for backup. In today's hyper-vigilant world, that exact level of unsupervised autonomy would literally result in a call to Child Protective Services. This daily reality forced Generation X to develop extreme self-reliance, not as a quirky character trait, but as a hardwired, neurological survival mechanism. When nobody is physically there to resolve your conflicts, entertain your boredom, or soothe your immediate anxieties, your brain is forced into rapid, premature maturation. You learn quickly that complaining to an empty house changes nothing, and that nobody is coming to rescue you. But here is where the psychological narrative flips entirely. Modern clinical psychology strictly classifies this lack of parental emotional involvement as a trauma, a direct precursor to severe adult anxiety, chronic dysregulation, and crippling attachment disorders. By every standard clinical metric used today, Generation X should be the most anxious, emotionally paralyzed demographic in human history. Yet the data shows the exact opposite. Why? Because what today's child psychologists heavily diagnose as childhood emotional neglect, neuroscientists are now recognizing as something completely different. The largest, most effective, involuntary clinical trial of exposure therapy ever conducted. Think about how exposure therapy actually works. It is the clinical practice of repeatedly facing the exact thing that terrifies you until your amygdala simply stops hitting the panic button. For Gen X, daily life was the exposure. Bullies at the bus stop? Figure it out. Sliced your hand open? Wash it out with the garden hose? Crushing boredom? Go outside and don't come back until the streetlights turn on. This constant, unmediated friction inoculated their nervous systems. They built a permanent neurological callus. While a modern, hyper-protected brain might spiral into a panic attack over an unreturned text or a workplace critique, the Gen X brain simply does not register it as a threat. They already survived the feral wilderness of a 1980s childhood, but physical and emotional survival was just phase 1 of their training. Phase 2 was far more complex. Generation X is the last fully analog generation and the first fully digital one. They are the only true technological bilinguals in human history. They grew up doing research in physical library card catalogues, yet they were the exact same people who seamlessly built the coding infrastructure of the early internet. This duality gave them something neither boomers nor millennials possess: massive technological adaptability without crippling digital dependency. They can leverage the digital matrix, but they aren't held hostage by it. Unplug the router, and a Gen Xer won't panic. They will just go read a book or fix a carburetor. So why does this analog foundation make them practically immune to modern cultural manipulation? It comes down to a deeply ingrained, highly protective layer of institutional cynicism. Generation X grew up watching every major authority figure fail. They watched the Challenger space shuttle explode on live television in their classrooms. They lived with the Cold War threat of total nuclear annihilation casually hanging over their heads. They learned early on that politicians lie, corporations have zero loyalty, and the fairy tale of the nuclear family usually ends in a messy, bankrupting divorce. This environment bred a fierce, undeniable pragmatism. They don't expect participation trophies because they know the real world doesn't hand them out. They don't demand a utopian, emotionally validating workplace. They just want to do their job, get paid, and be left the hell alone. This radical, quiet independence makes them the ultimate shock absorbers of modern society. But being the unbreakable bridge between two loudly clashing generations creates a very specific, dangerous type of internal pressure. That dangerous internal pressure comes from being the designated shock absorbers for the entire modern world. Generation X sits directly between the stubborn, traditional rigidity of the boomers and the highly sensitive, validation-seeking culture of millennials and Gen Z. In the workplace, in families, and in society at large, Gen X is constantly acting as the exhausted translator between a generation that refuses to change and a generation that demands everything change immediately. And they do this heavy lifting entirely in silence. Why? Because that childhood latchkey conditioning never deactivated. Their deeply wired neurological response to overwhelming pressure is to just put their heads down, internalize the stress, and handle it. They do not film their burnout for sympathy. They do not demand corporate wellness retreats to process their feelings. They simply drink another cup of coffee, fix the catastrophic failure no one else knew how to handle, and quietly go home. But this brings us back to the ultimate question, closing the loop on why being the forgotten generation evolved into their most dangerous weapon. Because when you are forgotten, you're completely free. When you grow up completely unmonitored, unmanaged, and unpraised, you never develop the crippling addiction to external validation that paralyzes modern society. Generation X does not need you to like them. They do not need you to affirm their existence. They do not require a collective consensus to make a difficult decision, and they are virtually immune to the modern fear of social cancellation because they never expected a gold star from society in the first place. This absolute lack of emotional dependency is their hidden mental blueprint. It is the core of their impenetrable psychological armor. In a world where everyone is desperately screaming to be seen, heard, and accommodated, the most formidable person in the room is the one who thrives comfortably in the shadows. Generation X is the silent, load-bearing wall holding up a deeply fractured society. They are the pragmatic problem solvers, keeping the engine running while everyone else argues over the paint color. They were the forgotten children who were handed a house key on a shoestring and told to just figure it out. And that is exactly what they did. They figured out how to survive. They figured out how to adapt. And ultimately, they figured out how to be completely unbreakable. But being unbreakable comes with a hidden cost, and understanding these unspoken generational blueprints is the only way to navigate a society that feels increasingly out of touch with reality. If you're tired of the mainstream noise and want to keep uncovering the raw, unfiltered psychology behind why we actually behave the way we do, hit the subscribe button. Join a community that doesn't need a gold star to seek the truth. And if you want to know exactly what created the highly sensitive, validation-seeking culture that Generation X is so exhausted from translating, you need to watch the video on your screen right now. It breaks down the exact psychological conditioning of the modern world, and it explains everything about the chaos we are currently living in. Click it right now and let's keep digging.